Reasonable Suspicion Training for Supervisors. Presented by All About Drugs Consulting. You must take the following 3 steps to complete this course. First, watch the entire DVD. Make sure to watch all 4 sections: regulations, drugs, alcohol, and the supervisors section. Second, take the written exam. You may take it online or on paper. Email or fax a copy of it to us and we will grade it. If you pass, we will send you a certificate of completion. This certificate is required by the Department of Transportation for supervisors of trucking companies. Remember, if you have any questions throughout this course, contact us for support. And now, let us get started. Welcome to the course in Reasonable Suspicion Training for Supervisors of CDL Commercial Motor Vehicle Drivers. Let's go over what you will be learning in this course. Firstly, what is Reasonable Suspicion Training? Reasonable Suspicion Training certification is required. You probably know that since you are taking this course. We will shortly explain why it is essential for supervisors to hold this certification. Among some benefits are legal protection for your company and protecting your safety rating, which is publicly accessible on the CSA website. Secondly, we will discuss the 5 types of drugs used for reasonable suspicion testing. You will learn to make observations about behavior which may be indicative of the abuse of drugs. To complete this course, first, watch the entire DVD. Make sure to watch all 4 sections: regulations, drugs, alcohol, and the supervisors section. Second, take the written exam. You may take it online or on paper. Email or fax a copy of it to us and we will grade it. If you pass, we will send you a certificate of completion. This certificate is required by the Department of Transportation for supervisors of trucking companies. Remember, if you have any questions throughout this course, contact us for support. And now, let us get started. Welcome to the course in Reasonable Suspicion Training for Supervisors of CDL Commercial Motor Vehicle Drivers. Let's go over what you will be learning in this course. Firstly, what is Reasonable Suspicion Training? Reasonable Suspicion Training certification is required. You probably know that since you are taking this course. We will shortly explain why it is essential for supervisors to hold this certification. Among some benefits are legal protection for your company and protecting your safety rating, which is publicly accessible on the CSA website. Secondly, we will discuss the 5 types of drugs used for reasonable suspicion testing. You will learn to make observations about behavior which may be indicative of the abuse of drugs. Thirdly, we will go over the effects of alcohol on the human behavior, and just as in the case of drugs, you will learn to make observations pointing to the abuse of alcohol. And lastly, we will discuss how supervisors should conduct the process of observation, documentation, and approaching a driver to ask him or her to get tested. We will also go over some of the more difficult situations in which drivers may refuse testing, and explain how to professionally handle them. If you have been asked to take this course by a manager or a supervisor, you're on the right track. This course is required by the Department of Transportation for all supervisors of truck drivers and other employees of safety-sensitive functions. We will momentarily discuss which employees this applies to. The FMCSA, or Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration, which regulates the trucking industry in the United States, has made it a requirement for supervisors of employees of safety-sensitive functions to undergo training in reasonable suspicion testing. This is per Regulation 382.603 of the FMCSR, Federal Motor Carrier Safety Regulations. You may read about this requirement on the website of the United States Department of Transportation by going to www.fmcsa.gov and searching for FMCSR 382.603. This regulation dictates that all supervisors of employees in safety-sensitive functions must undergo at least 60 minutes of training on alcohol abuse, and at least an additional 60 minutes on controlled substances use. Further, the regulation requires that each supervisor learn about the physical, behavioral, speech and performance indicators of probable abuse of alcohol and controlled substances. In other words, you must learn how each type of a controlled substance and alcohol affect the human behavior. This will allow you to correctly identify whether a driver is under the influence of alcohol or a controlled substance. Quiz time. In this course, you will periodically see a surprise quiz pop up on the screen. These quizzes are meant to test whether you have grasped the main concept from the previous section. These quizzes are not graded and you do not need to write down the answers. But be honest when taking them. They will definitely help prepare you for the final exam. Good luck, and let's get started.
Quiz number 1.
True or false? Reasonable suspicion training is required for supervisors of truck drivers and other employees of safety-sensitive functions. The answer is true. Reasonable suspicion training is not limited to truck companies. A trucking company is just one example of a business that requires reasonable suspicion certification for its supervisors. Now, let's go back to the course. Okay. Now that you understand that you must take this course, you may be wondering if there is any real benefit to this requirement. To say the least, there are many advantages of having completed training in reasonable suspicion. For one, without a certificate in reasonable suspicion training, you will not be able to legally request a driver to get tested. This is an extremely dangerous situation. If you suspect an employee of being under the influence, you should do everything in your power not to allow them to operate a truck. If a driver is obviously drunk or high, you of course have the right to stop him. But, what if you are not sure? What if an employee is exhibiting just a small amount of unusual behavior? Do you really know the exact signs of substance abuse to make the decision to request testing? If you are certified in reasonable suspicion testing, you have the right to make that call. Otherwise, you legally cannot do it. Secondly, if you send a driver for testing without training in reasonable suspicion, in certain circumstances, a driver could file a lawsuit against you. Think about it this way. If you haven't been trained to identify abuse of drugs and alcohol, and you decide to send someone for a test, you could be executing an act of discrimination against the driver. This case holds because without proper training you are guessing and assuming that someone may be drunk or high based on appearances, behavior and the like. This is why reasonable suspicion training is so important. So that in cases when employees may be using illegal substances you can legally send them for testing, and in cases when they are not, even if you send them, you will have done it with complete legal backing. Thirdly, having completed this training, you will have a greater knowledge about substance abuse. This will allow you to better identify potential abusers of illegal substances. This in turn will help you avoid alcohol and substance abuse violations that would have otherwise counted against your CSA score. Don't worry if you are not familiar with CSA. We will briefly discuss it momentarily. To summarize, the advantages of taking this course are as follows.
Quiz number 2.
Why should you, as a supervisor of a trucking company, obtain a certificate in reasonable suspicion training? A. Because it is required by the DOT. B. Because it will allow you to legally send an employee for a test. C. Because it will help keep a drug and alcohol-free workplace. Or D. All of the above. The answer is D. All of the above. Remember that this certification is required by the Department of Transportation, and without this certificate you would not be able to send employees for reasonable testing. In fact, attempting to send an employee for a test without certification may result in a legal lawsuit against you. Now, let's go back to the course. Alright, let's briefly go over CSA, Compliance Safety Accountability. Compliance, Safety and Accountability Program has been implemented by the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration for the purpose of assessing a carrier's safety score. Although carriers and owners may associate this program with roadside inspections violations and tickets, the underlying purpose of it is safety. There are 3 key aspects of CSA. The program ranks a carrier's safety score in 6 categories. All of the safety data is public, and the data that is used to compile the ratings is collected from roadside inspections. The scores are categorized into 6 categories, also called the basic factors. On the screen is an actual snapshot of a carrier's safety profile. As you can see, one of the categories is called Controlled Substances and Alcohol. Reasonable suspicion training will help you keep the score low. Remember, the lower the score, the better. In this example, the carrier has a perfect score in the Controlled Substances and Alcohol category. You may ask, how is this important? This leads us to the second point. All of this data is available to the public. In other words, anyone can go to SaferSys website and look up your company. Among those regularly doing that are shippers, brokers, insurance agents, drivers looking for employment, and the Department of Transportation. Everyone wants to know who they are dealing with before they engage in any business with you. The Department of Transportation is also browsing through the profiles looking for high scores. And when they spot them, they will visit you with an inspection. Therefore, it is in your best interest to keep your scores low. Lastly, all of this data comes from one source and one source only, roadside inspections. It is therefore very important for you to manage your drivers and make sure that none of them are abusing drugs or alcohol. This will most likely be spotted by an officer at an inspection and immediately affect your score. This has been our short overview of the CSA. The main takeaway message from this presentation should be that, 1. Everyone can see a company's score. 2. A lot of people and institutions that you deal with are looking at your score. And 3. Completing this course will help you keep a good score in one of the basic factors. We urge you to visit the SaferSys website and take a look at your score.
Quiz number 3.
Which of the following statements are not true about CSA? A. Anyone can access a company's score at any time. B. Only the Department of Transportation looks at a company's score in order to determine if the company should be audited. C. The score is determined only from data collected from roadside inspections. D. All of the above statements are not true about the CSA score. The correct answer is B. The DOT is not the only agency looking at your score. Brokers, shippers, insurance agencies, and even drivers looking for employment are accessing your company's score to determine if you are trustworthy. Remember, anyone can access your company's score, and the score is determined solely from roadside inspections data. Now, let's go back to the course. Let's go back to reasonable suspicion training. Let's recap what we've learned so far. Reasonable suspicion training will allow you to send a driver for a reasonable suspicion test. Consider a scenario where you come to work. You observe that one of your employees acts different than normal. You suspect that he may be taking illegal substances or may be abusing prescription drugs. You don't know what to do. Should you approach him? And how? What if the employer is just in a bad mood? Are you able to approach any employee in your company? Or just the drivers? These are some of the questions that we will answer in the next section. You will learn which employees you may approach. We will also introduce the 5 types of drugs that you will be trained to identify based on an employee's behavior. As we have hinted previously, drivers are not the only employees subject to reasonable suspicion testing. In fact, any employee performing a safety-sensitive function is. So, which job positions does this exactly entail? According to the FMCSA, safety-sensitive functions include all time from the time a driver begins to work, or is required to be in readiness to work until the time he is relieved from work, and all responsibility for performing work. All time at an employer or ship or plant, terminal, facility, or property, at any public property, or waiting to be dispatched. Inspecting, servicing, or conditioning equipment. All time spent at the driver's controls of a commercial motor vehicle. Any time in a commercial motor vehicle except in a sleeper berth. Loading, unloading, supervising or attending the loading or unloading of a commercial motor vehicle. Remaining in the readiness to operate a commercial motor vehicle. Giving or receiving receipts for shipments. Repairing or assisting in the repair of a disabled commercial motor vehicle. As you can see from this extensive list, truck drivers are not the only employees affected by this requirement. As a supervisor of any of these positions, you must undergo training in reasonable suspicion testing. In other words, if you supervise loading of a trailer at a warehouse, or oversee a mechanic repairing a truck, or you simply oversee a staff of workers inspecting trucks that are to be dispatched, you are required to complete this course. Unfortunately, many supervisors assume that reasonable suspicion training is limited only to those overseeing truck drivers. This, however, is not the case. Reasonable suspicion is required for, and limited to, specific private and public institutions and organizations. These include anyone who owns or leases commercial motor vehicles, anyone who assigns drivers to operate a commercial motor vehicle, federal, local or state governments, for-hire motor carriers, private motor carriers, civic organizations such as Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, disabled or veteran transportation services, and lastly, churches. All of the named institutions are required to provide training to their supervisors, should they oversee employees performing safety-sensitive functions.
Quiz number 4.
Which of the following employees would you be able to send for a reasonable suspicion test? In other words, which employees work in safety-sensitive functions? A. A driver that is not driving but repairing a truck. B. A driver that is not driving but helping load a trailer. C. A driver that is driving a truck. D. All of the above. The answer is D. As a supervisor, you could send any of the above-named employees for a reasonable suspicion test. The takeaway message here is that the safety-sensitive function in a trucking company is not limited to only driving a truck. Loading, preparing, overseeing work done on a truck, all count as a safety-sensitive function. Now, let's go back to the course. Now that you know about the requirements, let's move on to the first part of this course, the FMCSA regulations. All of these regulations can be found on the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration website. You can access them by navigating to www.fmcsa.dot.gov. Search for regulation number 392.603, Reasonable Suspicion Testing. In this course, we will summarize these regulations and provide a more comprehensive interpretation and steps that the supervisor should take. We will go over the procedures for supervisors while deciding upon reasonable suspicion and approaching an employee. We will conclude the course with the required overview of drugs and alcohol. Let's begin with the Federal Motor Carrier regulations. There are 5 different controlled tests, and many times, employers and employees confuse them. So let's briefly mention how they differentiate. First is the pre-employment test. A pre-employment test must be administered to all drivers that an employer wants to hire. A pre-employment test is a 5-panel drug test and it is DOT controlled. An employer cannot allow a driver to operate a vehicle until results from a pre-employment test have been obtained. Finally, a driver must take pre-employment test for every new company he or she wants to work for. A pre-employment test cannot be reused. Random drug and alcohol testing involves both a 5-panel drug test and a breath alcohol test. Random testing is required for all CDL drivers operating vehicles with gross weight over 26,000 pounds. Random testing is different from pre-employment testing, and many times, employers confuse the two. Random testing works by a designated administrator conducting random selections, whereby drivers are randomly chosen to undergo drug and alcohol testing to satisfy a specific quota. These selections take place on a quarterly basis throughout the entire year. A follow-up drug or alcohol test is only required when a driver fails a DOT-controlled test. Note that there may be a series of follow-up tests, usually lasting 12 months or more. A post-accident test, as the name suggests, must be completed after a driver is involved in an accident. The official regulations state that a test must be conducted when there are bodily injuries, death, or any of the vehicles were towed away. But in practice, it is always a good idea to complete a post-accident test after any type of an accident. Secondly, a post-accident test has time limitations. Notably, a drug test should be administered in no more than 32 hours after an accident, and an alcohol test in no more than 8 hours. In both cases, the tests should be administered as soon as possible, that is, as soon as you can find a clinic where a test can be taken. And finally, reasonable suspicion testing. As we've mentioned earlier, this testing is conducted when a supervisor makes an observation that an employee is behaving differently, exhibiting signs of substance abuse or alcohol misuse. Once again, the 5 types of controlled tests are pre-employment, random, follow-up, post-accident, and reasonable suspicion. Please do not confuse these. In our years of providing consulting services to trucking companies, we've observed that most violations occur because employers misunderstood the differences between these tests. As an example, an employer may have thought that a pre-employment test suffices in place of a random testing program, or that a follow-up test is not required after a positive drug test, or that anyone can request a reasonable suspicion test from an employee. Remember that violations involving DOT-controlled testing are types of acute violations, and controlled testing violations rank at the top of the list of violations in DOT audits.
Quiz number 5.
Which of the following statements are true? A. When a driver takes a pre-employment test, he doesn't have to take a random test. B. If a driver is sent for a reasonable suspicion test, this can count for his random test as well. C. Pre-employment, random, follow-up, post-accident, and reasonable suspicion are all different and separate tests. D. None of the above. The answer is C. The main takeaway message is that there are a different number of DOT-controlled tests, but each of them is a separate entity, even if they use the same method of testing and test for the same substances of abuse. Therefore, a driver may never say, "I've taken a pre-employment drug test, so I don't have to take a reasonable suspicion test." One test can never be substituted for another. Now, let's go back to the course. And now, let's go over the official DOT regulations for reasonable suspicion testing. The Federal Motor Carrier Safety Regulations Part 382.603 dictates that each employer shall ensure that all persons designated to supervise drivers receive at least 60 minutes of training on alcohol abuse, and receive at least an additional 60 minutes of training on controlled substances use. The training shall include the physical, behavioral, speech, and performance indicators of probable alcohol misuse and use of controlled substances. Recurrent training for supervisory personnel is not required. This training will be used by the supervisors to determine whether reasonable suspicion exists to require a driver to undergo testing under paragraph 382.307. This paragraph outlines the responsibilities and rights of a supervisor. Namely, an employer shall require a driver to submit to an alcohol test when the employer has reasonable suspicion to believe that the driver has violated the prohibitions concerning alcohol. The employer's determination that reasonable suspicion exists to require the driver to undergo an alcohol test must be based on specific, contemporaneous, articulable observations concerning the appearance, behavior, speech or body odors of the driver. An employer shall require a driver to submit to a controlled substances test when the employer has reasonable suspicion to believe that the driver has violated the prohibitions concerning controlled substances. The employer's determination that reasonable suspicion exists to require the driver to undergo a controlled substances test must be based on specific, contemporaneous, and articulable observations concerning the appearance, behavior, speech or body odors of the driver. The observations may include indications of the chronic and withdrawal effects of controlled substances. The required observations for alcohol and/or controlled substances reasonable suspicion testing shall be made by a supervisor or a company official who is trained in accordance with paragraph 382.603. The person who makes the determination that reasonable suspicion exists to conduct an alcohol test shall not conduct the alcohol test of the driver. Alcohol testing is authorized by this section only if the observations are made during, just preceding, or just after the period of the workday that the driver is required to be in compliance with this part. A driver may be directed by the employer to only undergo reasonable suspicion testing, while the driver is performing safety-sensitive functions, just before the driver is to perform safety-sensitive functions, or just after the driver has ceased performing such functions. If an alcohol test required by this section is not administered within 2 hours following the determination, the employer shall prepare and maintain on file a record stating the reasons the alcohol test was not promptly administered. If an alcohol test required by this section is not administered within 8 hours following the determination, the employer shall cease attempts to administer an alcohol test and shall state in the record the reasons for not administering the test. Notwithstanding the absence of a reasonable suspicion alcohol test under this section, no driver shall report for duty or remain on duty requiring the performance of safety-sensitive functions while the driver is under the influence of, or impaired by alcohol, as shown by the behavioral, speech, and performance indicators of alcohol misuse, nor shall an employer permit the driver to perform or continue to perform safety-sensitive functions, until 1. An alcohol test is administered and the driver's alcohol concentration measures less than 0.02, or 2. 24 hours have elapsed following the determination that there is reasonable suspicion to believe that the driver has violated the prohibitions in this part, concerning the use of alcohol. No employer shall take any action under this part against a driver based solely on the driver's behavior and appearance, in the absence of an alcohol test. This does not prohibit an employer with independent authority of this part from taking any action otherwise consistent with law. A written record shall be made of the observations leading to an alcohol or controlled substances reasonable suspicion test, and signed by the supervisor or company official who made the observations, within 24 hours of the observed behavior or before the results of the alcohol or controlled substances tests are released, whichever is earlier. In summary, the FMCSA dictates that all supervisors must undergo training. Supervisors must make clear observations, noting the indicators of alcohol and/or controlled substance abuse. Supervisors must act within a certain time limit, and keep records of all undertaken actions. They must also ensure that all employees suspected of alcohol or substance abuse be kept off duty until a reasonable suspicion is resolved. These are the official FMCSA regulations. In the second part of this section, we will demonstrate an application of these rules in practice.
Quiz number 6.
You have just watched our other long section listing all the FMCSA regulations. Don't worry if you didn't catch all the details. We will go over them in the next section. For now, let's test what you have understood from the last section. Which of the following statements are true? A supervisor may formulate a reasonable suspicion based on a driver's withdrawal symptoms of alcohol use. B. After observing indicators of alcohol abuse, a supervisor may have up to 24 hours to send the driver for a test. C. After completing a reasonable suspicion test, a driver may return to work as soon as the supervisor allows him. D. None of the above. The answer is D. None of the above. Firstly, a supervisor may formulate a reasonable suspicion based on the withdrawal symptoms of drug use, not alcohol. In other words, with alcohol, you must observe the immediate indicators of alcohol misuse. Whereas with drugs, you may observe either the indicators of drug use, or the indicators of withdrawal symptoms. Secondly, once a supervisor informs a driver that he must proceed for an alcohol test, the driver has 8 hours within which to take the test. If a test is not conducted within 8 hours, the supervisor must give up on requesting the driver to take a test. Additionally, if the driver doesn't proceed for a test within the first 2 hours, a report must be filed indicating this. The reason for such scrutiny over time frames with alcohol is due to the fact that alcohol is eliminated from the human body much quicker than drugs. And lastly, once a driver completes a reasonable test, he may only return to duty when the supervisor has received the test results, and the test results are negative. That was a long lesson and a long quiz. But you're doing great. This was probably the least interesting part of the course. We will now go over applications of these regulations. Now, let's go back to the course. Firstly, we will outline the procedures that each supervisor must act on. These procedures are meant to present a practical application of the FMCSA regulations we introduced in the previous section. The first step is to know the signs of the misuse of alcohol and illegal substances. These may include mood or behavioral changes exhibited by depressed behavior, unsteadiness, irritability, and mood changes. Absenteeism, or being absent from work, which is exhibited by frequent use of unplanned vacation, frequent unreported absences, and unexplained disappearances from the job. Work patterns. These include inconsistency in the quality of work, poor judgment and decision-making, and missing planned deadlines. Another sign is exhibited through accidents. Especially when an employee takes greater risks, has disregard for safety, and accumulates higher than normal accident rates. Finally, another sign of substance abuse may be unusual relationship with coworkers. This may be exhibited by overreaction to criticism, avoiding people, borrowing money, or unusual complaints about personal matters. These are the typical signs of possible substance abuse that a supervisor should pay attention to. A complete list detailing all of the signs can be found in the booklet that accompanies this video. The second of the 4 steps tells us to document your observations and send an employee for testing. In documenting your observations, you must make a clear observation of any behaviors from step 1 presented earlier, along with any of the following physical indicators of impairment: constricted pupils, dizziness, sweating, sniffles, flushed skin, violent behavior, needle marks, possession of items such as a syringe, needle, or an aerosol can. Combined with the warning signs from the first section, these indicators will provide a good basis for making a case for reasonable suspicion. Next, you must clearly document your observations. You may use the forms included with this video course, or you may use your own forms. Make sure to detail as much as possible of your findings, including the name of the employee, the position of the employee in the company, the supervisors to whom the employee answers to, the date of your filing of the report, and the exact time and place where you have made your observations. Additionally, when gathering the documentation, you should collect any supporting documents, such as witness testimonies, or recorded or photographed evidence of abnormal behavior recorded by a security camera, for example. Another important aspect of documentation and making observations with regards to reasonable suspicion is the timing. There are 4 important times to keep in mind. First, A supervisor has 24 hours within which to file a written report. Second, a written report must be filed before the results of the requested test come in, if that takes place before the otherwise required 24 hours. Third, a request for an alcohol test can be made only when an employee is carrying out safety-sensitive function, right before or right after it, or during what we call work time. And fourth, another work time factor limits the time during which an observation is made to those 3 times: during work, right before, or right after work. This is very important. As an example, if you hang out with an employee after work and notice that he or she is exhibiting signs of substance abuse, you will not be able to use that observation for reasonable suspicion. Let's continue with the 4 steps. In step 3, you must carry out a determination of reasonable suspicion and take action in confronting the driver. In this step, you will determine what action to take, and then execute it. Having collected data from observations in steps 1 and 2, you will now process the information to determine if reasonable suspicion is present. To help you determine this, answer these questions. Has the behavior indicating substance abuse occurred recently and in work? Or is it something that you've observed some time ago, have been analyzing it, and only now have decided to take action? Remember, your observations have to be recent. They have to relate to actions that have happened on the same day that you decide to take action. Is the observation coming from a reliable source? In other words, did you observe this or did someone report this observation to you? And, if the observation was reported, how reliable is the person giving you information? Remember, at least one supervisor or manager has to be the one making an observation. Can the observation be documented and explained? In other words, can you document an action, behavior or physical appearance? Can you give the time and place where it happened? This, tangible data, is acceptable. Hearsay or personal judgment are not. Remember, you are looking for facts that can lead to reasonable suspicion. Not the other way around, where judgment and suspicion lead to creation of facts. If you are unable to document an event which led to your suspicion, then you most likely do not have a case for reasonable suspicion. Can you make a clear distinction between the indicators of substance abuse versus a reaction to medicine? Are you sure that the employee in question is not exhibiting signs of tiredness, fatigue, or a medical condition? Remember, reasonable suspicion is an educated assumption based on observation, and you do not need to be 100% certain that an employee is abusing substances or alcohol. On the other hand, reasonable suspicion is more than just a hunch. If you are aware of the fact that an employee is working too much or is dealing with a medical condition, then perhaps his behavior reflects that. However, if you cannot tell which it is, then you have the right to request a reasonable suspicion test from the employee. It is always safer to have a test done than to write off a suspicious behavior. And finally, do any of the indicators reflect the employee's physical appearance, behavior, or performance at work? Again, being able to document tangible data is the key to making a call on reasonable suspicion. If you can see it, smell it, observe one's change of behavior or mood, or clearly see an unexpected difference in work performance, then you have a valid sort of observation. If you have answered yes to all of the above questions, then you have a strong case for reasonable suspicion, and you should proceed to confronting an employee about the test. When confronting the driver, you should adhere to the following procedures. 1. Speak with the driver in a private setting. Don't confront the driver with others present nearby. You are discussing a very private matter, and the driver may be embarrassed to have coworkers overhear your conversation with him. It is a good practice to call the driver into your office and talk behind closed doors. 2. Speak only the facts. Tell the employee about your observations. Include only what you've observed and provide the date and time when the observation was made. Explain that such behavior is indicative of substance or alcohol abuse. Do not express your opinion. You should never tell an employee that you think that he is abusing drugs because of some behavior that you've observed. Remember, based on the indicators that you have observed, you have a reasonable suspicion. This is not a factual determination or a personal hunch. You must wait until the results of the tests come in before you can make a claim about drug or alcohol abuse. 3. Do not convict the employee. Remember that you are simply following protocol, because you are suspecting an employee of using drugs or alcohol. You have no certainty about it, therefore, do not make judgments. Inform the employee that you are following standard procedure, and inform him that this request does not mean that he is a drug or alcohol user. It simply means that you are concerned about the employee based on the indicators that you have observed. Lastly, make it very clear that a reasonable suspicion test request is not a conviction. No one is making a claim that an employee is abusing any substances. Many times employees will feel judged and misinterpret a confrontation like this as a conviction, and being labeled as a drug user or alcohol abuser. 4. Speak with authority and keep your composure. Do not let the employee change your decision. Some employees may truthfully describe a situation which had caused them to exhibit suspicious behavior, but others may be experts in hiding an addiction. Whatever the truth is, you have made a decision and you must execute it. If an employee is defensive and grows aggressive, do not argue and do not fight with the employee. Keep your composure and document everything. A good way of calming the situation is to repeat the facts, not opinions. Inform the driver about your observations, again stressing the fact that reasonable suspicion doesn't make the claim that he is using drugs or alcohol. The final step involves taking action and summarizing it in your report. By now, you should have a drafted report which includes your key observations with detailed facts and dates specific to your observations. You have also presented the employee with your findings. Now is the time to finalize the procedure. Choose a test location where you will have the driver report to for testing. You should have a designated location on file, and preferably one with which you are contracted to conduct testing using the Department of Transportation chain of custody forms. Note that a driver may suggest a location and time when he can proceed for testing. You must only send a driver to a location designated for your company. Furthermore, the driver shall go for the test when you request it, not when he feels like the time is right. Remember that this is a reasonable suspicion test request, and you are in charge of calling the location, date, and time. Act accordingly with authority and note any issues or conflicts that the driver may present. Secondly, you must have a designated employee within your company escort the driver for the test. At no point should you permit the driver to drive on his own, whether it be to the test location or elsewhere. If at any point the driver disobeys the request and attempts to operate a motor vehicle while being under reasonable suspicion, you should call the police immediately. To the best of your judgment, the driver may be under the influence of drugs or alcohol, and the law prohibits you from allowing such person to operate a vehicle. An occurrence of refusal may take place, and you should be prepared to deal with it appropriately. If the driver refuses to proceed with testing, you must present your company policy that deals with test refusal. Clearly tell the driver what the consequences will be for refusing the reasonable suspicion test. Once again, if the driver attempts to operate a motor vehicle, you must stop him or call the police. A driver refusing testing and dismissed from work will most likely try to drive off in his own vehicle. You must either arrange a pickup for the driver by a family member or a friend, or if the driver insists on driving himself, immediately call the police. Never use force against the driver when attempting to stop him from driving. Instead, call the police. And finally, conclude your documentation. Your documentation should now include the observation details, your decision to request testing for the driver, and details of the time and location of the testing facility and the staff that will transport the driver to the facility. If any issues had arisen, such as test refusal, document the details in your report, date it and sign it. Keep all documents in your company file database. Remember, you must complete the documentation within 24 hours, or before the test results come in, whichever occurs first. It is best practice to complete it immediately, while the details of your observations and confrontation with the driver are still fresh. This concludes the last step in the supervisor's procedure for handling a reasonable suspicion situation. We've just gone over the 4 steps: knowing the signs of substance abuse, documenting observations, determining whether the observations qualify for a reasonable suspicion decision, and taking action in approaching the driver and sending him for a test.
Quiz number 7.
John is a direct supervisor of Greg. While at work, John observed that Greg was showing signs of alcohol abuse. But because he couldn't quite describe them, he never wrote down his observations. He just had a feeling that something was different about Greg and couldn't explain what it was. 2 hours after work, John met Greg at a store, and since the situation from work was still in his head, he explained to Greg his suspicions and asked him to proceed for a test. Greg refused. Think about this situation. Was Greg correct in refusing the test? Can you think of some mistakes made by either Greg or John in this scenario? Hopefully you thought of few of the following. 1. Greg's observations cannot be valid if he cannot put them on paper. If he only has a hunch about some odd behavior but cannot describe it and place it on paper, then such observations are useless. 2. A supervisor may only request a reasonable suspicion alcohol test when an employee is at work, right before or right after work, not 2 hours later and outside of work. Therefore, in this situation, it is not that Greg is okay refusing the test. Rather, it is incorrect of John to request the test 2 hours after work, and outside of work at a store. Instead, Jen should have requested the test while Greg was still at work, or right when Greg was about to leave the company. Which best describes how you should approach an employee when informing him or her about a reasonable suspicion? A. Invite the employee to a private setting, speak with authority, but don't convict the employee. Only state the facts of your observations. B. If possible, take the employee to a private setting, be friendly and explain your opinions and thoughts about your thought process in making the decision. C. It's always good to have a witness, so speak to the driver with a witness present. Be firm in your choice of words, and if you think that the employee is a drug or alcohol abuser, state it. D. None of the above. The answer is A. A private setting is preferred and no witnesses are required. Never state your opinions and never make the claim that someone is drunk or high on drugs. You don't know that. You only know that, to your best judgment, that person has been exhibiting signs of substance use or abuse. Stick to the facts and be authoritative in your delivery of the message. Which of the following is an example of a question that you should ask yourself when making a reasonable suspicion? A. Are you, as a supervisor, 100% sure that a driver is using illegal substances? B. Is the data observed reliable and can it be explained and documented? C. Has the driver been acting this way for at least 10 days? D. None of the above. The correct answer is B. You should ask yourself if your observations come from a reliable source, such as yourself or a first-person account and preferably another supervisor, and can you explain the behavior in words, and write it down for the records? Remember, as a supervisor you are not 100% certain that an employee is abusing drugs or alcohol. In fact, this is not the point of reasonable suspicion. The goal of this program is to look out for the signs of possible substance abuse based on one's behavior, speech, and appearance. Keep this in mind. You are not trying to figure out if someone is using drugs or alcohol at work. You are trying to figure out if an employee is exhibiting signs of behavior which could indicate the use of drugs or alcohol. These are two very different things. Now, let's go back to the course. Okay. Let's move on to the third part of this course, application of the supervisor's procedures. In this section, we will review 4 case scenarios involving interaction between a driver and a supervisor. This will help effectively summarize the theory presented in the previous section. Let's get started. At a truck yard, a supervisor is discussing parking procedures with a driver. He observes another driver behaving different than normal. Let's watch. In this segment, we will demonstrate the correct interaction between a supervisor and an employee, whom he suspects is using alcohol while on duty. Welcome to Eagle Transportation Company. The man in a white shirt, Greg, is doing rounds with his newly hired driver, pointing out his errors from pre-trip reports. While the two men discuss pre-trip inspections, they observe Charlie, a company driver, who is acting suspiciously. Let's watch.
John, you gotta secure that reefer cover a little tighter. If that falls off your truck, it could hit a car. You could lose your CDL. You didn't go through all this work just to lose your license and be put out of business by something falling off your truck. You know, we had this really great student, great guy a few years ago. The problem was, he could never perform a proper pre-trip.
Charlie's been acting a little weird lately.
What do you mean weird?
He's kind of distant and he's got some problems at home, I've heard, and he's also being a little distant.
I better go talk to him. John, you finish up here.
Alrighty.
Hey, Charlie.
Yeah, boss.
Hey, Charlie, can you come down so we can talk?
Yeah.
What do you need?
I'm gonna need to talk to you in my office, Charlie.
Okay.
You wanna clean up the rest of this stuff here? In our policy on debris.
Let's go over a few points in the video we've just seen. Notice that even though an employee informed the supervisor about Charlie's odd behavior, the supervisor himself made the observation. This is an important point. The supervisor took into consideration what the driver said about Charlie, but decided to pursue the case himself and investigate if the claims could be legitimate. Notice that even though the driver informed the supervisor that Charlie has had family problems, the supervisor did not rule out possible use of drugs or alcohol. Instead, he proceeds to determine whether Charlie's odd behavior may be due to use of illegal substances, or simply as a result of family problems. To investigate, the supervisor proceeds to approach the driver. He follows Charlie to his truck, knowing that it is a suitable setting that will give him privacy to discuss his concerns. The supervisor had previously observed Charlie walking unevenly and swaying to the sides. When he opens the truck doors and notices an alcohol bottle and a brown bag, he has a clear visual that immediately alerts him to reasonable suspicion. Let's recap the scenario. First, the supervisor was informed about Charlie's odd behavior by an employee. Next, he went to confirm this firsthand. And having spotted clear evidence through his investigation, he asked Charlie to have a word in his office. In the next video, we will observe the confrontation between the supervisor and Charlie. Notice again that this conversation is taking place in a private setting behind closed doors. Having established a case for reasonable suspicion, the supervisor is now set to explain the situation to the driver. Let's watch what happens.
Come on in. Hi, Charlie. Sit down. Charlie, I saw you walking across the yard today. It wasn't like you. Is there something you want to tell me about?
I have been having problems at home, and it's hard for me to pull it all together, but I do like the job and I do not want to lose the job.
I understand, Charlie. If you're having some problems here that's affecting your performance at work, or if you need some time to collect your thoughts, you know you can always talk to me. But understand, after seeing what I saw today, I'm going to have to send you for a reasonable suspicion test.
But why? I told you I was just cleaning out my truck and the bottle fell out. Must have been one of my old bottles or old trash.
Charlie, I know you're a good driver. I know you wouldn't do anything stupid like drinking to risk your job here. But I have to send you for a reasonable suspicion test.
Okay, I'll go after I finish duty.
Charlie, you have to go right now. I have to send you for the test within 2 hours of telling you about it.
I know a facility nearby and I can go.
Charlie, I need to make the appointment for you, and I have to have Greg escort you there.
Escort me? Why escort me? I just came back from a 300-mile trip. I can drive myself for a few miles, don't you think?
Charlie, I'm going by the book here. I have to make the appointment, and I'll have to have Greg escort you. Do you understand?
Yeah.
Let's review some key points from this video. First, notice how the supervisor stated facts about his observation pertinent to the driver's recent change in behavior. Second, he informed the driver that based on these observations, he has decided to send him for a reasonable suspicion test. And thirdly, despite the fact that the driver attempted to explain himself, the supervisor was persistent and calmly repeated his decision. Also notice that the supervisor did not condemn the driver in any way. He even praised the driver for his quality of work, and stated that he doesn't believe that the driver would risk his job with drinking alcohol on duty. But based on what he had observed, The supervisor is obligated to proceed with the request. Okay. Let's take a look at another example. This time the supervisor is suspicious of the driver using illegal substances. Pay close attention to the driver's behavior and physical appearance. They will be key indicators in this scenario. In this video, Gilbert has just returned from the road and is delivering trip reports to the company dispatch. As he talks with a dispatcher, his supervisor appears, and oddly, Gilbert avoids him at all costs. Let's watch the video.
Oh, hey Gilbert, how was the trip?
I don't like it. John keeps on sending me out west, and, I can't stand that area out west, and he just keeps on sending me out there.
Oh, you should try and talk to him. He's a pretty good guy. He'll listen to you.
Someone's got to do the load. It'll likely be me. I forgot some paperwork in my truck. I'll be right back.
Hi, Gilbert. Can I talk to you in my office for a second?
Can I wait a minute? I got some paperwork out in the truck, and the truck's running out.
I have a word with you in my office right now.
Can it wait?
I'm your supervisor, and I need to have a word with you in my office right now.
Why is it like this? I get the worst loads, now it's like I have to report like I'm in prison.
I'm your supervisor.
I have to go get some paperwork.
I think I have everything, Gilbert. In fact, I have all your paperwork right here. Gilbert?
In this video, we have a classic example of an employee avoiding his supervisor, most likely attempting to conceal something. Let's go over some key points. First, notice the physical signs that may otherwise be out of place in an office setting. The driver is wearing quite large sunglasses indoors. Is he trying to hide something? Perhaps bloodshot eyes, which would be indicative of possible substance abuse. Secondly, let's look at the behavioral signs. Notice how the driver is carrying his conversation with the dispatcher. He seems to be nervous and speaks faster than normal. He is also repeating himself and can't get his thoughts together when discussing his dislike for his manager's choice of routes. Alone, these signs may not mean much, but when you put them together, they may as well indicate something suspicious going on with this driver. Let's continue to the next scene. Here, Gilbert spots his supervisor. Notice his reaction, as he immediately withdraws from the office. Clearly he is trying to avoid him, and this should be a clear indicator that a driver wearing sunglasses indoors, and trying to avoid his superior, is up to something. Let's continue the clip. Observe here, that when the supervisor asks Gilbert to step into his office, Gilbert overreacts with anger and clear frustration. The verbal exchange between the two men turns into an argument on Gilbert's part. The driver is clearly avoiding the supervisor, to the extent that when confronted by him, he simply refuses to talk to the supervisor and walks away. Also notice from this video how Gilbert is manipulating his confrontation with the supervisor by changing the topic, as he starts to complain about his routes. All of these behavior and physical signs indicate that there is clearly something that Gilbert is trying to hide. This is a case for a reasonable suspicion test. Let's observe what happens when, after some time, Gilbert comes to himself and decides to speak with the supervisor for his request.
Hey John, did you need to talk to me?
Yeah, come on in, Gilbert. Come on in, have a seat.
I'm sorry about acting up before. What did you want to talk to me about?
Yeah, I did want to talk to you because I noticed you've been acting not like you. You've been shaky, you've been out of control, and what's with the sunglasses inside?
The sunglasses, I got into a fight last night. I didn't want everybody looking at me thinking I got beat up.
Gilbert, based on what I've seen today, I need to send you for a reasonable suspicion test.
For what? Why do you need to send me for some tests?
I need to send you for a reasonable suspicion test. I can have someone drive you.
I'm not going anywhere. I don't get it. I get in a fight last night. I'm having a bad week. I get the worst loads out of everybody in the company. It's ridiculous.
I'm your supervisor. I'm concerned about the safety of everybody in this company, and I'm going to have to send you for the test.
Well, I'm not going anywhere.
If you refuse to go, I'll have to do the proper paperwork, and understand the company will probably ask you to leave. Now it's your decision. Take some time and let me know what it's going to be.
Okay. Let's analyze this confrontation between the supervisor and the driver. Initially, the driver puts himself in a favorable position by respecting the supervisor's request for a meeting. Notice, however, the signs of unrest when the driver is told to take a reasonable suspicion test. His flat refusal to comply with the request may be clearly indicative of drug or alcohol abuse. Secondly, observe his eyes. Without the glasses on, the driver appears to have blackened and bloodshot eyes. Together with the unusual behavior, physical appearance, nervousness and plain refusal to take the test, this scenario appears more than likely that Gilbert is using drugs. In the next section, we will concentrate on specific drug types and resulting physical and behavioral indicators associated with them. But before we move on, let's briefly examine the supervisor's behavior during this confrontation. The key points are as follows. The supervisor remained calm throughout. The supervisor listened calmly to the driver's explanation. And, when the driver refused the test, the supervisor clearly stated a company policy in such situation, which is to release the driver from the company. Following this meeting, the supervisor will have documented the meeting and submitted the proper documentation to have the driver's employment with the company terminated. Great. We're making progress. Which of the following are true? 1. If an employee starts arguing during your discussion about your reasonable suspicion, you should argue back because you are the supervisor. 2. If the employee attempts to explain his behavior and appearance, it is best to repeat your observations and persistently inform the employee about your decision. 3. By sending an employee for a reasonable suspicion test, you are more or less informing him that you believe that he has been abusing drugs or using alcohol. The answers are 1. False. You should never argue back or engage in a verbal fight with the employee. If such situation takes place, calmly restate your position and document the driver's behavior. 2. True. Repeating your observations and inciting on your decision is the best way to speak with a driver who is trying to explain why he has behaved the way that had alerted you to reasonable suspicion. This brings us to question number 3, which is false. By sending a driver for a reasonable suspicion test, you are simply stating that his or her behavior exhibits the signs of possible drug or alcohol use. But you are not making a statement that a driver is using alcohol or drugs. Those are two very different things. The reason why you should think about it this way is that there are a number of reasons why a driver may have been acting the way he was, and they do not have to involve drugs or alcohol. For example, if a driver is going through a tough time at home, perhaps facing a divorce, his behavior will have changed and may be mistaken for that resulting from taking depressant drugs. Similarly, if an employee has a medical condition or cannot sleep at night and had been prescribed sleeping aids or antidepressant pills, perhaps such legal drugs may exhibit the same signs of use as those prohibited by the FMCSA. Therefore, it is essential that you understand and explain to the employee that you are not making a definitive ruling regarding the employee's use of drugs or alcohol. Now, let's go back to the course. So far, we've introduced reasonable suspicion training, explained the benefits of the course, listed the institutions for which this training is required, briefly explained what CSA is, provided a short introduction to different types of DOT tests, and went over the 4 steps that supervisors must follow when deciding upon reasonable suspicion. In the last section, we've shown you 4 case scenarios exemplifying how supervisors should behave during a reasonable suspicion observation and confrontation with the employee. In the next section, we will go over indicators of substance and alcohol abuse. We will concentrate on the 5 drugs that reasonable suspicion tests for under DOT controlled testing. Study of these indicators will help you make a better determination whether drugs or alcohol are used and misused at work. The next section will be presented by Mr. Jeffrey Clark of Eagle Corporate Solutions. Mr. Clark is a veteran transportation business consultant, owner of CDL driving schools, and a professor at Harper College. Let's begin the next section. Indicators of substance abuse and misuse.
This presentation is reasonable suspicion training for safety-sensitive functions and supervisors in the transportation industry. It's of critical importance that you, as safety professionals and supervisors, recognize the symptoms of drug and alcohol abuse. The drugs we'll be concentrating on are PCP, marijuana, cocaine, amphetamines, ecstasy, and opiates. It's important that we know which each one of these drugs are and their effects on the human behavior. The DOT testing is commonly referred to as a 5-panel drug test that includes marijuana, cocaine, amphetamines, opiates, and phencylamine. Ecstasy is included as an amphetamine. The drugs and their subcategories that are included in a DOT 5-panel test are marijuana, cocaine, amphetamines, methamphetamines, MDMA, MDA, and MDEA. Let's take a look at some of the specific drugs. The first drug we're going to look at is PCP. What is it? Dissociative psychedelic. Tranquilizer is a drug that was previously used as an anesthetic agent. It is a dissociative drug. Dissociatives are a class of psychoactive drugs which are said to reduce or block signals to the conscious mind from other parts of the brain, exhibiting hallucinogenic and neurologic effects. As a recreational drug, PCP may be ingested, smoked, or snorted. PCP comes in both powder and liquid forms, but typically it is sprayed on the leafy materials such as cannabis, mint, oregano, parsley, or ginger leaves and then smoked. Some of the common street names are angel dust, wet, Sherm, Sherman Hemsley, Rocket Fuel, Ashley, Larry, Sherman's Tank, and a variety of others. In order to adequately ascertain whether someone is on PCP, we need to know the behavioral symptoms or behaviors of people on PCP. Let's take a look at some of the effects of PCP. Tolerance, dependence, and withdrawal effects. Most PCP users administer the drug intermediately, although daily use has been reported and tolerances may develop. There is evidence of tolerance to behavioral effects of PCP in animals. PCP can be addicting and can lead to psychological dependence, craving, and drug-seeking behavior. There has been no demonstration of physical dependency in humans. Upon abrupt discontinuation, physical distress, lack of energy, and depression are reported. Long periods of use may lead to memory loss, difficulties with speech and thinking, depression, weight loss, These can last up to a year after cessation of use. As a safety professional, it's important that we recognize the behaviors associated with the use of PCP. Next, we're going to look at marijuana. We're going to look at what it is and certain behaviors that can indicate use. Marijuana continues to be one of the most widely abused drugs that we're coming across. Cannabis, known as marijuana in its herbal form, is a psychoactive product of the plant Cannabis sativa. Its common name is grass, pot, or weed. The main mind-altering ingredient in marijuana is THC, but more than 400 other chemicals are also in the plant. A marijuana joint is made from the dried particles of the plant. The amount of THC in the marijuana determines how strong its effects will be. The more potent marijuana increases physical and mental effects and the possibility of health problems for the user. Hashish or hash is made by taking the resin from the leaves and flowers of the marijuana plant and pressing it into cakes or slabs. Hash is usually stronger than the crude marijuana and may contain 5 to 10 times as much THC. Pure THC is almost never available except for research. Substances sold as THC on the street often turn out to be something else, such as PCP. Let's look at the effects of marijuana and what to look for on employees that we might suspect are using marijuana. What are some of the immediate effects of smoking marijuana? Some immediate physical effects of marijuana include a faster heartbeat and pulse, bloodshot eyes, and a dry mouth and throat. Studies of marijuana's mental effects show that the drug can impair or reduce short-term memory, alter sense of time, and reduce ability to do things which require concentration, swift reactions, and coordination, such as driving a car or operating machinery. Are there any other adverse reactions to marijuana? A common bad reaction to marijuana is the acute panic anxiety reaction. People describe this reaction as an extreme fear of losing control which causes panic. These symptoms usually disappear within a few hours. What are some of the physical effects of marijuana? Marijuana smoke has been found to contain more cancer-causing agents than is found in tobacco smoke. Examinations of human lung tissue that have been exposed to marijuana smoke over a long period of time in a laboratory showed cellular changes called metaplasma that are considered precancerous. In laboratory tests, the tars from marijuana smoke have produced tumors when applied to animal skin. In laboratory tests, the tars from marijuana smoke have produced tumors when applied to animal skin. These studies suggest that it is likely that marijuana may cause cancer if used for a number of years. Many marijuana users assume that marijuana is a very inactive drug and something not that harmful. The research would seem to indicate exactly the opposite. One of the questions that comes up pretty regularly in our interactions with drivers are, what about medical marijuana? Although some jurisdictions have legalized medical marijuana, it's still a prohibited drug by the Department of Transportation in all its uses. Under the CFR 40.151, what are medical review officers prohibited from doing as part of the verification process? As a medical review officer, you are prohibited from doing the following as part of the verification process. You must not verify a test negative based on information that a physician recommended that employees use a drug listed in Schedule 1 of the Controlled Substance Act. Therefore, medical review officers will not verify a drug test as negative based upon the information that a physician recommended that the employee use medical marijuana. Please note that marijuana remains a drug listed in Schedule 1 of the Controlled Substance Act. It remains unacceptable for any safety-sensitive employee subject to drug testing under the Department of Transportation drug testing regulations to use marijuana. So here's a case where medical marijuana may be legal in some jurisdictions, but it is still a prohibited drug by the Department of Transportation.
Which of the following statements are true about the drugs we have just discussed? A. When you observe that an employee has bloodshot eyes, a faster heartbeat, and is experiencing uncommon panic attacks. This could indicate that the employee has been using marijuana. B. When an employee appears to be oddly upbeat, happy, energetic and has gained weight over time, this could indicate possible use of PCP. C. Angel dust and wet are another names for marijuana. D. None of the above. The answer is A. Marijuana increases heart rate and may cause panic attacks. PCP has depressing effects, and causes weight loss, not weight gain. Angel dust and wet are another names for PCP, not marijuana. Now, let's go back to the course.
Cocaine. Cocaine is a crystalline topolate alkaloid that is obtained from the leaves of the coca plant. It is both a stimulant of the central nervous system and an appetite suppressant. Its effects can last from 20 minutes to several hours, depending on the dosage of cocaine taken and the purity and method of administration. What are some of the effects? Cocaine is a powerfully addictive drug. Once having tried cocaine, an individual may have difficulty predicting or controlling the extent to which he or she will continue to use the drug. Cocaine's stimulant and addictive effects are thought to be primarily a result of its ability to inhibit the reabsorption of dopamine by nerve cells. Dopamine is released as part of the brain's reward system and is either directly or indirectly involved in the addictive properties of every major drug of abuse. Use of cocaine in a binge, during which the drug is taken repeatedly and at increasingly high doses, leads to a state of increasing irritability, restlessness, and paranoia. This may result in a full-blown paranoid psychosis in which the individual loses touch with reality and experiences auditory hallucinations. What are some of the long-term effects of cocaine use? Repeated cocaine use can cause the following health consequences: irregular heartbeat, heart attack, chest pain, respiratory failure, stroke, seizures and headaches, abdominal pain and nausea. Chronic users of cocaine can become malnourished due to the drug's ability to decrease appetite. Each method of taking cocaine can produce specific health effects. Snorting. Some of the things we'd be looking for would be a chronically running nose, nosebleeds, loss of smell, hoarseness, and problems swallowing. Ingesting cocaine can cause severe bowel gangrene due to reduction of the blood flow to the intestines. Injecting. Severe allergic reactions, including risk for contracting HIV, hepatitis, and other blood-borne diseases. Next, let's look at amphetamine. It's important that we recognize amphetamines and amphetamines abuse. Amphetamines and driving has a long history. Amphetamine, or amphetamine, is a psychostimulant drug of the class which produces increased wakefulness and focus in association with decreased fatigue and appetite. It's important that we recognize amphetamines and amphetamines abuse. Physical effects of amphetamine can include hyperactivity, dilated pupils, bloodshot eyes, restlessness, flushing, dry mouth, headache, fever, diarrhea, constipation, blurred vision, dizziness, twitching, insomnia, and a variety of other effects listed here. There is also significant research which highlights the changes that amphetamines produce in the dopaminergic system, even in clinical doses. One possible interpretation is that neurological effects exist even with doses approved for medical use. Psychological effects. can include euphoria, anxiety, increased libido, alertness, concentration, energy, self-esteem, aggravation, grandiosity, repetitive and obsessive behaviors, paranoia, and with chronic or high doses, amphetamine psychosis can occur. Ecstasy. Ecstasy, or MDMA 3 and 4, is a synthetic psychoactive drug that is chemically similar to the stimulant methamphetamine and the hallucinogenic mescaline. MDMA causes an increase in the serotonin, which plays an important role in the regulation of mood, sleep, pain, appetite, and other behaviors. The excess release of serotonin by MDMA likely causes the mood of elevating effects experienced by users. MDMA releases large amounts of serotonin and causes the brain to become significantly depleted of this important neurotransmitter, contributing to the negative behavioral after effects that users often experience for several days after taking MDMA. According to the National Institute on Drug Abuse, studies have shown that some heavy MDMA users experience long-lasting confusion, depression, and selective impairment of working memory and attention processes. Users can exhibit the same impairments as amphetamine, heroin, cocaine, and hallucinogenic users. Driving ability is affected by ecstasy can include slowed thinking and reflexes, making reacting difficult, distorted visual and depth perception, difficult making complex decisions, lengthened glare recovery time, overly confident in driving skills and judgment, lapses in attention and concentration. The driver is unable to display continuous attention, distorted vision, auditory and visual hallucinations, Next, let's take a look at opiates. Opiates have a profound and serious effect on those who abuse them. The list of benzodiazepines and opiates is very long. Benzodiazepines are also known as tranquilizers and sleeping pills, and are commonly used for the treatment of anxiety or sleeping problems. Opiates, also known as narcotics, are a group of medications used to relieve pain, but which have a higher potential for addiction and abuse. Some opiates, such as heroin and opium, are taken from the resin of the poppy and are basically manufactured for street distribution. Heroin in the bloodstream is converted into morphine, which mimics the action of endorphins, creating a sense of well-being. Opiates. What are the effects? Whenever someone uses opiates and develops a tolerance for the drug, the possibility of drug overdose is always a concern. Some of the signs are difficulty breathing, fingertips and lips turn blue, shallow breathing, weak pulse. Over the long term, opiate addicts may display these kinds of symptoms: collapsed veins, refusing to eat, ignoring basic personal hygiene, liver disease, pneumonia. Drugs in the workforce is a very serious problem. There are some misconceptions on the average user. Let's take a look at some statistics that might surprise you. According to the Institute for a Drug-Free Workplace, 73% of all drug users are employed. 7.4 million workers used drugs last month. 52% of all workers who tested positive for drugs are daily users. Drug abuse seldom goes unnoticed. 35% of the workforce has seen coworkers use or talk about drug use.
Determine whether each of the following statements is true or false. 1. Cocaine is a very addictive stimulant. 2. Amphetamine is a very popular drug among drivers because it causes alertness, better concentration and hyperactivity. 3. Ecstasy is especially dangerous for drivers because it causes slowed thinking reflex, visual and depth perception. 4. Opiates cause a faster heartbeat and hyperactivity. Here are the answers. Number 1 is true. Cocaine is very addictive and it is a stimulant drug. Number 2 is also true. Amphetamines give one the false sense of alertness and better concentration. Like cocaine, it is a stimulant. Therefore, both of these drugs may be of choice for drivers that require to be awake during night driving, and alert on the road. Number 3 is true as well. Unlike cocaine and amphetamines, ecstasy slows one down. It slows reflexes, reaction time, and depth perception. This is a very dangerous drug for drivers as it impairs abilities to make quick, clear decisions. Answer number 4 is false. Opiates, just like ecstasy, slow one down. They will slow your heartbeat and cause a weak pulse. They may also cause difficulty breathing. It's best if you categorize the effects of these drugs into those that stimulate the human body and mind, and those that depress the body. Stimulants are those drugs that drivers may reach for in order to get a dose of energy for the long road. Depressants are those drugs that will calm the body and mind, relaxing a driver, and dangerously slowing down the reflexes and decision-making capabilities. Both groups are very dangerous, especially for truck drivers. Now, let's go back to the course. This is the end of our overview of the analysis of drug abuse in the workplace. Next, we will go over the misuse of alcohol.
Next, let's take a look at alcohol. What is it? Alcohol remains the most problematic drug in America. Alcohol use is staggering. Well, you might remember earlier we talked about use and misuse of drugs and alcohol. Alcohol is probably the most used and misused drug all in the same time. The alcohol that is consumed at bars or parties is created by fermentation, a process in which the yeast fungus feeds on the sugars and/or starches in certain plants, such as barley or grapes, and extrudes alcohol along with carbon dioxide. From the cheapest beer to the most expensive wine or after-dinner liqueur, all alcohol is made with the same fermentation process. The different colors, tastes, and strength and flavors come by the different fruits or vegetables used, as well as the additives, byproducts, and diluting substances of the fermentation process. Next, let's take a look at how long drugs and alcohol stay in our system or are detectable on a reasonable suspicion test. Alcohol is a drug that is absorbed into the bloodstream from the stomach and small intestine. It is broken down by the liver and then eliminated from the body. Until the liver has time to break down all of the alcohol continues to circulate in the bloodstream, affecting all of the body's organs, including the brain. In general, the liver can break down the equivalent of about 1 drink per hour, and nothing can speed this up. Alcohol depresses the brain and slows down its ability to control the body and the mind. This is one reason why alcohol is so dangerous. Alcohol acts like a sedative and slows down muscle coordination, reflexes, movement, and speech. If you drink too much alcohol, your breathing or heart rate can reach dangerously low levels or even stop. Knowing how long alcohol stays in our system and its effects is of critical importance to us as drivers. We can go out and party and drink the night before and come to work the next day after sleeping all night thinking we're fine. As you can see from this chart, that might not be the case. One of the common misconceptions is that if I stop drinking last night, I'll be perfectly fine going to work the next day. As supervisors, it's critically important that we have an understanding of exactly how long alcohol can stay in the system. In this example, our subject went to bed at 2 a.m. with a 2.50 blood alcohol content. As we can see, we ceased all drinking and went to bed at 2 a.m. At 6 a.m., we wake up ready for work. Notice on the chart we're still at a 1.90 blood alcohol content. 7 o'clock, driving to work, a 1.75. 8 a.m., arriving at work, a 1.60. 9 a.m., a 1.5. 10 a.m., a 1.30. 11 a.m., a 1.15. 12 noon, 0.100. 1 p.m., I'm not feeling too good, 0.085. So we can see, although we ceased all drinking at 2 a.m., went to bed, got up, drove to work, at 1 p.m. the next day, fully 11 hours after ceasing all drinking, we are still legally drunk at 0.085. 2 p.m., I'm just under the limit, 0.70. 3 p.m., still a little tipsy, 0.40 at 4 p.m., fully 14 hours after ceasing drinking. 5 p.m., 0.25. 6 p.m., finally okay to drive at 0.01. So as we can see, knowing how long the alcohol affects the body are of critical importance to us as safety supervisors to understand our responsibilities in this. Drinking in the morning, often being drunk for long periods of time, or drinking alone. Changing what you drink, such as switching from beer to wine because you think it will help you drink less or keeping you from getting drunk. Feeling guilty after drinking. Making excuses for your drinking or doing things to hide your drinking, such as buying alcohol at different stores. Not remembering what you did while you were drinking. Worrying that you won't get enough alcohol for an evening or a weekend. Alcohol abuse, possible complications. Alcoholism and alcohol abuse can increase your risk of many health problems, including bleeding in the digestive tract, brain cell damage, brain disorder, cancers of the esophagus, liver, colon, and other areas, changes in the menstrual cycle, delirium, tremors, dementia and memory loss, depression and suicide, erectile dysfunction, heart damage, high blood pressure, inflammation of the pancreas, liver disease, including cirrhosis, nerve damage, poor nutrition, sleeping problems. Alcohol use also increases your risk for sexually transmitted diseases and violence. Drinking alcohol while you are pregnant can lead to severe birth defects in the baby. Signs and symptoms of too much alcohol. Flushed face, slowed speech, unsteady gait, smell of alcohol, poor memory, altered reality, slow response, impaired visual tracking, impaired signal detection, erratic cognitive function, difficulty following directions, impaired distance or time judgment, constricted pupils, impaired coordination, altered perceptions, poor concentration, aggressive behavior, sleep disturbance. The sheer numbers of alcohol-related deaths and crashes are staggering. According to the 2009 National Survey on Drug Use and Health, an estimated 10.5 million people aged 12 or older reported driving under the influence of illicit drugs during the year prior to being surveyed. This corresponds to 4.2% of the population aged 12 or older, similar to the rate in 2008, and not significantly different from the rate in 2002. In 2009, the rate was highest among young adults aged 18 to 25. In addition, we see the following being reported. In 2009, an estimated 12% of persons aged 12 or older drove under the influence of alcohol at least once in the past year. This percentage has dropped since 2002, when it was 14.2%. Of critical importance to us is fatalities by roll and crashes involving at least one driver with a blood alcohol concentration of 0.8 or higher. As we can see from the chart, alcohol use significantly increases the chances of accidents and injuries. How big is the problem? In 2009, 10,839 people were killed in alcohol-impaired driving crashes, accounting for nearly 1/3 of all traffic-related deaths in the United States. Of the 1,314 traffic deaths among children 0 to 14 years in 2009, 181 or 14% involved an alcohol-impaired driver. Of the 181 child passengers aged 14 and younger who died in alcohol-impaired driving crashes in 2009, about half were riding in the vehicle with the alcohol-impaired driver. In 2009, over 1.4 million drivers were arrested for driving under the influence of alcohol or narcotics. That's less than 1% of the 147 million self-reported episodes of alcohol-impaired driving among U.S. adults every year. Drugs other than alcohol are involved in about 18% of motor vehicle driver deaths. These other drugs are often used in combination with alcohol. Nearly 1 in 3 of all people who die in automobile and truck accidents are the result of alcohol. This is a very serious problem. As we can see from this data statistics chart, alcohol-impaired driving deaths are 10,839. It's very important that the training we do now helps us understand the effects and behaviors of alcohol so we can recognize any employees that may be susceptible to alcohol driving. Alcohol abuse and misuse isn't limited to one age group or gender. Who is at risk? As we can see in the chart here, broken down for male and female, we can see the percentage of risk in different years and by gender. What part of the U.S. had the highest annual rate of alcohol-impaired driving? The Midwest Census region had the highest annual rate of alcohol-impaired driving episodes at 643 per 1,000 population, which was significantly higher than the rates in all other regions. Excluding 12 states and D.C. with small sample sizes and potentially unstable rates, 4 of the 7 states with the highest rates of alcohol-impaired driving were in the Midwest. The Midwest also had the highest prevalence of binge drinking at 16.5%, which was significantly higher than the prevalence in the Northeast, West, or South. Nearly 1 in 3 crash deaths involve an impaired driver. In 2009, 10,839 people died in alcohol-impaired crashes. Young people have the highest risk of being involved in an alcohol-impaired crash. Drug and alcohol detection, detectability. Here we'll take a look at how long certain drugs stay in the body and are detectable. PCP from 8 to 30 days after use. Marijuana from 7 to 30 days after use. cocaine, 1 to 3 days after use. Amphetamine, 1 to 3 days after use. Opiates, 1 to 3 days after use. Alcohol, 12 to 24 hours. Ecstasy, 1 to 3 days. As you can see from this presentation, drug and alcohol abuse is a very serious problem with deadly consequences. It's up to us in the transportation industry to do our part. We need everyone working together to reduce these numbers. You as safety supervisors, your drivers, your mechanics, us as safety professionals, we all need to do our part to ensure that our nation's highways are as drug-free and alcohol-free as they can possibly be. This begins with us. We can do more as safety supervisors to recognize and reduce these types of accidents than anyone else. We see our drivers every day. We see those that work for us. Learning how to recognize behaviors that could possibly be an indication of drug or alcohol abuse is very, very important and critical to what we do. We've talked about recognizing drug and alcohol abuse. It's also important that we document any behaviors that we witness. It's important to note that if you do make an observed behavior or send someone for a reasonable suspicion test, that we follow a few basic rules. Whenever possible, 2 people should make the observation, a confirming observation whenever possible. Although not required, this is helpful. Also, having a company policy that clearly defines the responsibility of those making the decisions is of critical importance. Your company policies should include a document that can be submitted to any reasonable suspicion test where the supervisor making the observation can document time, observed behaviors, and signed by the supervisor, and preferably a second one as well. It's important to note that the federal regulations require that someone sent for a reasonable suspicion test cannot be returned to a safety-sensitive function until the negative test result is received by the company. Also, someone sent for a reasonable suspicion test should in no circumstances be allowed to drive to the collection site. They should be provided transportation by someone other than those making the observation. Your company policies should spell out in great detail every step of an observed behavior, following all the guidelines set forth in the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration. Your company policies should spell out in exact detail the responsibilities of everyone within your organization to follow all Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration regulations. In the event of a positive test on reasonable suspicion, your company policies and Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration guidelines need to be followed to the letter, involving your specific company regulations regarding SAP or other evaluations. As we talked about earlier on preponderance of the evidence, don't be afraid to send someone for a test if you suspect that they are in need of a reasonable suspicion test. One of the greatest disservices we can do to our employees, our company, and ourselves is to not send someone for a test when we think there is reason to do it. The effects of not sending someone for a reasonable suspicion test when there was evidence they should have been are staggering and expensive to you and your company. If you're not sure of your company's drug and alcohol requirements and responsibilities under these regulations, consult your company immediately. If a suspected alcohol test cannot be given within 2 hours of the observation, a detailed record must be made of why the test was not completed. If no alcohol test is given for observed behaviors within 8 hours, no further test can be given after the 8 hours. Consult your company policies for further guidance. It's important to note that an individual being sent for a reasonable suspicion test cannot be returned to duty until a negative test has been received by the company.
Congratulations! You have just completed the Reasonable Suspicion course for supervisors of trucking companies. Next, complete an exam online, and upon passing of the exam, you will receive a certificate by email. You should have received information about signing up for an online exam with the purchase of this program. If you require additional certificates and exams, please contact All About Trucks at 224-238-3155. Thank you for your participation. You may go back to the main menu of this DVD and watch each chapter individually, or review the quizzes you have taken. Reasonable Suspicion Examination and Certification.